Now, tonight, David Deane, familiar face, an associate professor of practical theology at the Atlantic School of Theology, joins us. And David, not so long ago, maybe a month ago, we were talking about Pope Francis when he was in the throes of double pneumonia. It feels more as much, perhaps, a celebration of his life as there is sadness today in some ways.
Yeah, that definitely seems to be the atmosphere, that people are celebrating a life well lived, that people are reflecting on his legacy. Despite that, though, it did come, to me at least, as a little bit of a shock in that the news was that he had made and was making a recovery from his near-death illness a month ago. And so it was a bit of a shock this morning. But yes, as you say, people are reflecting and reflecting with celebration on a life well lived.
This was, and I'm going to use your words here, a consequential pope. How did he change the church?
Well, he had a massive impact on the church's perception. It seems strange to talk about these things when we're used to speaking about more theological matters. But if one was to think of the church as a brand, it's a brand that has been transformed radically during Pope Francis' pontificate. The church was associated primarily with decline, with scandals such as sexual abuse scandals and things of that nature within the public imagination. And Pope Francis changed the vibe significantly through his compassion, through his outreach to the poor and the marginalized, through his care for the environment. He may not have changed the church radically, but he changed the public perception of the church radically. And this has had a profound impact.
Why was that necessary?
Well, I think the previous Pope, Pope Benedict, and I'm a massive supporter and admirer of Pope Benedict, his approach was to offer a radical riposte to the forces of modernization and secularization, and to position the church as a radical alternative to secular domination. And while this may have had many positives, it also had the sense of putting the church on a siege mentality, in a siege footing. And this siege mentality wasn't helped at all by the fact of sexual abuse crises and financial crises and other crises. When Pope Francis assumed the pontificate, his approach was to find commonality. His approach was to embrace aspects of modern culture, and instead of having a pugilistic style designed to compete with secular ideology, he wanted to find things that the church shared with secular approaches, such as, again, care for minorities, care for those on the margins, care for the poor, care for migrants, and care for our common home in Laudato Si, the environment. And so this was a massive change in posture of the church towards the wider world. And this was received very, very differently by that wider world. And we see that today in obituaries all across the media.
We've heard a lot about his humility and how he wasn't interested in some of the largesse or some of the perhaps trappings that the opulence that could come with the position. He was intent on continuing his pastoral care. Is that right?
I think that is very true to his self-understanding. He saw himself as a humble figure, as a humble pope, and he was very consciously striving to create that impression. I don't believe for a second that it wasn't genuine. I do believe it was genuine, but at the same time, one might argue that humility involves seeing yourself as largely insignificant to the role, that the role is what matters, and therefore you simply do what others have done, and if you like, melt into the role. That wasn't Pope Francis. Pope Francis put his own stamp on it from minute one. When my wife met the Pope, for example, she immediately knelt to kiss the papal ring. She wasn't acknowledging tremendous respect for him as a person, but the office, the papacy. And even though he was an elderly gentleman at that stage, he got both arms under her arms and lifted her up, hoisted her up, and refused to let her kiss his ring, because he was being humble. But that's the tension there, that his humility was itself a self-aware, I wouldn't say arrogant move, but it was certainly a self-aware refusal of what had gone before, saying, I am here, I am doing something different, and I am being humble. And that's a distinctive thing.
He signaled that from the very moment he stepped out on the balcony back in 2013, and he addressed the crowd with "Buonasera," good evening, in the language of the common people, in Italian, not in Latin. And I remember having been there among those throngs of people, the utter shock and delight of the crowd at that. Very simple gesture, but the way it was received.
Absolutely. It really was. There was a sense in which previous popes, they applaud along with the crowd, and they accept the adulation of the crowd because they know it's an adulation of the office. Pope Francis, in a sense, refused that adulation and straight away very humbly announced himself with "Buonasera." And I remember well all the fears and tension lifting at that moment, and a sort of a sense of joy passed over the crowd, and a sense of joy passed over me too. It was a hallmark of a very genuine person.
Can you talk a bit about the significance of his visit to Canada and that apology to our Indigenous peoples?
I think, for me, one of the most profound aspects of it was that this wasn't a political move by a political pope who was responding to his Secretary of State. What had happened was a group of survivors from residential schools had went to Rome to meet with the Pope, and they told him their stories. And he was overwhelmingly moved by those stories, and he felt overwhelming sadness and shame and guilt and love for the people who told him those stories. And it was in response to their request that he come to Canada and he apologize on Canadian soil that Pope Francis completely changed his plans for the following few years and put Canada firmly on his roster. And so it came from the heart. And then when he came here, he spoke from the heart. It wasn't precise. He didn't use precise language. He didn't use political language. It wasn't press managed. It was from the heart in response to the people who he had spoke to, survivors of residential schools, that he felt love for and shame for what the church had been complicit in. So it was genuine, it was real, and it was meaningful because of that.
A few seconds left here, David. We're being told to expect a simpler service, a wooden coffin, for example.
Yeah, and in the past there is coffins have been, there were three parts to them, designed to withstand the ages. And Pope Francis has eschewed that. He's going for a much more simple coffin. The person who's in charge of the funeral arrangements is himself a fairly simple man, an Irish man. And he will oversee things in keeping with the Pope's wishes. And so it will be a simple service, and it will take place, I think, relatively quickly, because within 15 to 20 days, we will have a new conclave.
That's right. David Deane, always appreciate your insight and your thoughts on these matters. Thank you for being with us.
Thank you so much, Todd. Appreciate it.
We will take a break. We'll be back with much more of your show after this.